All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Tony Ferris, a graduate printmaking major here, originally from Long Island, and I got my BS from SUNY Oneonta. As a part of my work, I'm helping to organize an online event every Wednesday. So we call them Wednesdays. I'm sure you know that by now. Um, Before I introduce tonight's presenter, let me share three pieces of housekeeping. First of all, we're recording this event and we'll post the link at brucegallery.info. We want to hear from you. Post your questions and comments in the chat, and I'll share them as time permits. Um, Thirdly, we are ending by 6:30 p.m. tonight. However, we'll be back next week, same time, same link for another investigation of the gallery's permanent collection in an organized by Kalolo Lockett, a Pittsburgh independent curator. Kalolo was invited, and Edinburgh alum Patricia Bellin Gillen and Edinburgh graduate student Rachel Malley to discuss their use of animals, our fellow beings, and their drawings, paintings, prints, sculptures, and writings. Now let me introduce Ron Blevins. Ron was trained as an animator and cartoonist at the University of Maryland, Baltimore campus. In addition to his day job, Ron continues his work as an independent artist working in his studio and on occasional commissions. Tonight, Ron will be sharing one of his passions with us, the creative, ever-evolving game of Dungeons & Dragons, D&D, and this is where I let you take the floor.
Yeah, so I'm Ron Blevins, artist and animator. I have been playing Dungeons & Dragons now for 6 years, and I have been dungeon mastering for just as long. So it's been a big part of my life for a long time, and I just wanted to share the history of how it's changed in the last couple of years, and how originally I thought it was too nerdy for me to play. It was sort of the last thing that I would ever want to do, and it completely changed, and now it's something I do every single week of my life. So I'm going to share my screen real quick. You see that okay?
I'm not seeing anything. Is it up?
How about now?
Good now.
Great. All right. So Dungeons and Dragons, not just for nerds anymore. I think I would just start with a little brief history about Dungeons and Dragons, talk about its creator, how it sort of became what it was, and then how people thought about it for years. And then I'll talk about what it is today and ways people can get involved doing it. So Dungeons and Dragons was conceived by two men. The first man, his name is Gary Gygax, famously known as the creator of Dungeons and Dragons. He was born in Wisconsin. He moved to Lake Geneva when he was very young. He always had an interest in fantasy and things like that. But his main interest was he would play these things called war games. So before there was Dungeons and Dragons or anything like that, people would play war games with miniature army men on battlefields like this one to reenact battles and things like that. And it was basically like how they do war reenactments out on a battlefield, except the army men had their own sets of rules and things like that that people would get to fight each other that way. And he was always very interested in it. However, he had another great love that was fantasy. So he was very much into things like Tolkien and fantasy genre literature growing up. which really you can see how it inspired Dungeons and Dragons. Things like the hobbits and orcs and a dark lord, a dark land, things like that, goblins, all included inside of that work. Very much informed how D&D would eventually look when it was created. But before that, he had a different place. Um, he started at a place called Gidden Games, where he started designing uh, miniature war games himself. One of the first games he designed while at Gidden Games was Chainmail. So this was a war game like the one from before, except it was medieval themed. And you would move little knights and peasants around on a battlefield, and that was how you played the game. And you could see where what was once very sort of different from D&D now starts to become a little bit more related to how you know of it, how you might know of it. During this time, Gary Gygax also met Dave Arneson, who was the other co-creator of the game Dungeons and Dragons. The two of them basically took the war game idea and minimized it. Instead of playing platoons of people, they would instead take on the persona of one character. So in Dungeons and Dragons, you play as one person, but there is a mechanic aspect associated with that one person. So if you were a strong person, you would have a bonus to you would be more capable of doing something than a person who was very smart. And the person who's very smart could think through problems or figure something out or know knowledge quicker. And then these things would be associated with rolling dice. So basically, they would roll d6s, which are just the regular six-sided dice. And the accumulation of those numbers with any relation to their characters would basically determine if they succeeded or failed in any endeavor. So Gary Gygax is actually the creator of the Gen Con in Chicago, though originally it was held in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. It was the Lake Geneva Convention, not to be confused with the regular Geneva Convention. But he started it as just an idea of coming together with a couple of friends at this convention center and playing war games for a weekend. And since then, it has happened, and it's still happening today, and it is now the largest gaming convention in North America. All started by the creator of Dungeons and Dragons years ago. And I'm pretty sure he attended those Gen Cons for years up until his death. So after Gidden Games, Arneson, Gygax, and their friend Don Kay all left to found their own company. And that company was called Tactical Studies Rules, or TSR, in 1973. This was their chance to create something more their own that they could basically publish under themselves. In addition to what would become D&D, they published something called Dragon Magazine, where they would basically put all their ideas, their game design, their news about recent games, like reviews. They would put together a magazine and start, whoever would mail in a subscription and pay, they would send them out monthly. And that was how they started to get revenue in. And eventually, this led to the design of the very first version of Dungeons and Dragons. So the version that first came out does not resemble the version now very closely, but there is some threads that remain. The main thing being this idea of a a character that you play by yourself with a group of friends that have a dungeon master who sort of tells them the results of their successes and failures. And their first three publications was in this format, where the first one was about the characters, the second one was about the monsters, and then the third one was about the world or the dungeons and things like that. And that's sort of where this idea of Dungeons and Dragons came from. They were the adversaries of your characters. So Dungeons and Dragons would basically get developed and have new content created for it. Every year it was out on the market. And eventually they would sort of change the thing so much or re-release it in a way that it would be separate from the previous version. So they began to call these later on, they called them editions. So what the pictures were of before wasn't even the first edition of Dungeons and Dragons, technically. It was just the paper magazine they were printing out of their shop. But when it started getting put in stores all around the coast, they published it as Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, sometimes coined AD&D. And this first version was really what sort of had a popular selling point of this idea of playing as a mage or a knight or an elf in this world. And every single couple of years, they would re-release a new version that has been updated with different settings. Like there was like a vampire gothic setting, or like a naval ocean setting, things like that, or one that was, you know, a completely different, like sort of sci-fi setting. And they would have new new mechanics added in, some would be taken out, things would change around. And it has gone through it 5 editions now. The one we are currently in, 5th edition, is 2014. So it is 7 years old now. And I actually started playing in the 4th edition before I started learning the 5th one. And it's been an interesting journey. So the 5th edition of Dungeons and Dragons has been its biggest, most popular boom yet. This version of the game was simplified from its previous editions and made much more accessible, which contributed a lot for people who were new to the game to be able to pick it up and play it themselves. And there's a couple other reasons why it got so popular. But here's another example of how things are built and changed. So a funny story is a lot of the monsters that they used in D&D were created solely because the things they had to play with when they were playing this game, you know, in their homes back in the 70s, was they had to go get really weird knockoff McDonald's toys and things like that that looked like weird monsters that became things in the game. So they would have like a plastic dinosaur that didn't look like any real dinosaur, and it would look like an owl, and they called it an owl bear. Or in this case, they had basically a ball with string on top of it, and they called it the beholder. And it's just a ball with a big eye and a mouth with tiny eyeballs coming off of it. And from the very first edition, as you can see in 1975, that is how it looked then. But because this idea became so intertwined with the game, it stayed through all the way to the current edition of Dungeons and Dragons. And now it looks like the thing down in 2003. You could see how it changes and morphs depending on each edition and what they were writing at the time. So TSR did go bankrupt in 1997. They were bought out by Wizards of the Coast, which was a company that produced a lot of toys and kids marketing relating to fantasy, things like Magic the Gathering cards and Pokemon cards, things like that. And they were able to take those ideas that were so part of the cultural norm and, or, you know, very people wanted to keep playing these games and were able to take it up to a more express level where they could sell better books and reach more people. In fact, the books are still coming out today. So the most recent being the Candlekeep Mysteries, which came out this year, just a month ago, and Whit Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft, which is coming out later this year. So the other big contributing factor to the popularity of Dungeons and Dragons now is media. There has been a big interest in media, whether it is podcasting or streaming, or even television or streaming services. They look for these D&D live play, where people would basically play their game but present it live online. Became very popular with people because they could watch others have adventures and basically spy in on a world that, you know, they could meet every week. These people were playing, they were friends already. They were just sort of sharing their adventure with you in real life. So things like Critical Role, Acquisitions Incorporated, which is related to the Penny Arcade uh, comic and convention, and the Adventure Zone, all got very popular around the same time, and really brought in a lot of new people because they made the game even more accessible to people. You know, they were like, well, if these guys can do it, I can too. So what it was when I thought about D&D at these times was, I thought D&D was the nerdiest thing you could do. Like, when I was watching cartoons as a kid growing up, I saw the Dungeons and Dragons cartoon, which is up there at the top. You know, you see these sort of Captain America, very poorly animated kids, you know, dressed up in tights and things like that. Or you think of Dexter's Lab or SpongeBob, who they would always treat Dungeons and Dragons as the butt of a joke, where it was like, oh, these are nerdy characters. These are the nerdiest thing they can do, and even they don't do it regularly. Like, they would get bullied for playing Dungeons and Dragons, so no one does that, right? They're sort of looking around, and that was why, in my mind, it was always like I could never play. Oop, I lost some pictures. Oh, they're coming in. But the outlook on cartoons and Dungeons and Dragons has changed drastically since it became popular again. Now there are cartoons that take place or have analogs of Dungeons and Dragons in their own worlds. And Dungeons and Dragons even reaches out to these properties and creates content with them. So there is an actual Dungeons and Dragons supplement for the cartoon show Rick and Morty. Rick and Morty was a very popular cartoon, and the creators of it loved Dungeons and Dragons, so they got together and made a whole book about a sort of crossover universe. So people who might have thought that Dungeons and Dragons was too nerdy before may see this and think, okay, well, now I can play because it's got my favorite stuff in it. And even shows that reach out to little kids, like She-Ra and the Princesses of Power on Netflix, show D&D in a very positive light of people, you know, having a social gathering together instead of, you know, demonizing it like other shows might have. And I think one of the best examples of it becoming popular again was in Stranger Things when it came out. This sort of nostalgia factor for the game made a lot of people go out and seek it out because they wanted to experience that. So by having it in this game where kids were playing it and it related to all the different story elements in a way that it sort of became popular again, it is now in the lexicon for a lot of people to try to seek it out on their own. You know, when they say, hey, there's Dungeons and Dragon books at my comic book store, I should check them out, it becomes a lot easier to start playing the game that way. So to sort of wrap up everything else, I wanted to come up with some or show some ways that people can get involved with Dungeons and Dragons in their everyday life. Uh, Despite, even if you think that you want to do it, there are some hurdles that you still might think are in the way of doing that. Um, and I just want to see if I can help in any way to help get over those hurdles. Especially nowadays during the COVID-19 crisis pandemic, there are even I play D&D every single week, and there's plenty of ways for people new to the game can find out how to play it. There are a lot of online spaces that are always looking for new people to play that can join forums or uh, servers of people talking about it on Discord. People who meet on Zoom after work and play together via like this live. And there are even means to play the Dungeons and Dragons tabletop experience online as well. So sites like Roll20 and programs like Foundry Virtual Tabletop are basically the D&D experience of moving your little miniatures around and having all your character information, but in an online context that people can all play on. So here's a couple of examples of where I play D&D online. So, it's even though I can't see my friends in person, I can still talk to them online and have a great social experience, just playing games with them that way. And the other, I think, big hurdle when getting into Dungeons and Dragons is finding a group to play with. Sometimes you don't know how to play and you don't know, all the rules or what's right and wrong. Sometimes you don't have a ton of friends who have open schedules. Uh, so it's hard to find a group to actually play with. And that's where, when I was in that situation, I turned to the official Adventurers League. So basically, this is a group of people who run a sort of formalized version of the game publicly for people who can sign up at every comic book store that holds it. Basically, if you go to their website, you can search your area and find out if there is a comic or local chapter of the Adventurers League that is already running it in place. And that could be a great way for you to, talk to someone in person if you want to go to this comic book store to find out more. Maybe find out online via email if they're accepting, new people to join their group still, or if they're still meeting for games during COVID-19. And it's just a really great resource for finding ways to play in real life. So I would definitely suggest checking it out, and I'll repost that link later. And that pretty much wraps up the talks I had about ways to get into Dungeons and Dragons. There's my Twitter at the top if you ever want to check out my work. And I have a couple of links that I'm going to post in the chat for people to access more resources. And one of them being the actual rules of D&D. They have a simplified version for people to read up on and understand the basic rules of the game. I'll post the link to Adventurers League. And then finally, I'll post the link to a site called D&D Beyond, which is affiliated with Dungeons and Dragons and has a lot of resources for creating characters, gameplay rules, products, things like that.
I think this would be a good time if anyone has any questions to post them in the chat. I'll start it off with one. Before we started this chat, we were talking about characters.
Yeah.
I think what you were saying about, what goes into, just the relationship between the player and their character was very interesting. So if you could just, go over that again so everyone can get a nice hearing on that.
So your character is your way to interact with the world. At a basic level, it's a bunch of numbers that tell you how much to add or subtract from the dice you roll. The primary dice in Dungeons and Dragons is a 20-sided die called the D20. And basically for any action you want to do, whether you want to attack an orc or persuade an army to help you, you would roll this dice and then add an appropriate modifier based on what your dungeon master would explain to you. But beyond just being a statistic thing, there is a lot of added stuff in Dungeons and Dragons to make your character feel more exciting and more interesting, like a character that would be in a Tolkien book or something like that. You can add backstory or backgrounds to your character that sort of give you a sense of where they grew up or what they, what their career was like. um, there are weapons you can get. What kind of weapon does your character wield? Why do they know how to do that? Spells is a big thing. If your character has magic of some kind, where did they get that magic? How did they learn it? Or did they get it from some powerful source? The character creation plays a big factor in the game, whether you are doing it for just playing the game or for role playing reasons. So a lot of people play the game and like to get into character, like you would in a play or something like that, where you get in a dungeon master's job in a lot of ways is to get you invested in the narrative. So you want your character to succeed or to go rescue someone. Like what are they getting? What are you getting out of it as a person? And what are they getting it out of it as a character? So it really depends a lot in what kind of circumstances you're playing. But the character can be anything.
All right, we got a question. How long do games last? What is best game you've played? Why was it so good?
So games can last anywhere from 2 hours to 10 years. People will run games regularly at the comic store I know, where they just run what we call a one shot, where it's sort of a small like adventure that can be finished in a couple of hours. um, and there's also people who will play very long games that maybe they can't meet up every month or something like that, but they like to continue the story of their characters growing in power and the story unfolding over long periods of time. There's people who do that too. I would say typically a game will last anywhere from like 2 months to a year on average, just because a lot of the games are written to be that way. So there is a narrative element that is worthwhile. And what was the second parts of the question?
What is the best game you've played, and why is it so good?
I play in. I think one of my favorite games was when I first joined the Adventurers League. It was very new and sort of scary in some ways, and the adventure was taking place in a dark jungle continent with zombies that would come up out of swamps and had dinosaurs that would, chase you around. And there was like a dark dungeon you had to go into with these spirits that could possess you. And I think that particular adventure affected me for a long time because it was so new and exciting in that way. And that would be probably my favorite adventure that I can remember. But there's a lot to like about all of them.
What's the longest game has ever happened? Like, is there just one that all the people know? It's like that's the one. It's still going on. Like,
no, I don't think there's like there might be a Guinness World Records for longest game ever run, but it feels like it would be hard to qualify. Like there's something provable there.
All right, we got some more questions. How much does it cost to play, and do players always play the same role usually?
It doesn't cost anything to play. You can get a lot of the resources you need online, and use just the basic stuff to play the game. The price comes in when you want to buy all of their extra material. So they release books full of different options and gameplay things, and different worlds you can play in that have different characters and types of powers that your character can use, different magic. These things can start to add up. Some people get addicted to buying very different and pretty kinds of dice. There's, people can spend hundreds of dollars on this game. But I think what really, says something about their accessibility is the fact that you can play for free if you'd like to. Um, and do players always play the same role? No, you don't have to play the same role. Some people prefer a certain kind of character or like way of playing. Um, that would be up to them, but it's not like you have to play the same thing. The game now is very balanced to a point where you can play pretty much whatever you want and still have a great time. And a lot of it depends on the person running the game, your dungeon master. I've had dungeon masters who are really, really mean and will, try to kill your character so that they, die in the game. But then other people who just didn't want you to have fun and will, roll with the punches.
Uh, well put. We got a question from Misha. Can you explain the difference between a book campaign and a homebrew content?
Yeah, so or Wizards of the Coast puts out book campaigns and content pretty regularly throughout the year. I think right now they're on a schedule of 3 major releases each year, whether that is content to a partnered thing or a new story. They usually will do a new story every year or a new setting, like the one Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft I talked about earlier is about the setting that of Ravenloft, which is sort of a gothic vampire setting. Very, it's all misty and shadows, and there's werewolves and witches and things like that. So that is different from the traditional D&D world. So they made a separate one. And what is cool is that as people who have the rules and understand the game, you can make up your own stuff. I have my own setting that I made up. A lot of people who stream online just to differentiate themselves enough from Dungeons and Dragons, they'll make their own settings. And that is why a lot of people call it homebrew content. So that'll be like something you come up with at home. So that, if your world is a little bit different from the one described in the books, that's okay. It's your world. You make it what you want.
We got another question from Leonard Vesley. Hopefully I said that right. Is D&D considered a competitive game? Is it like esports tournaments?
No, I would say D&D's main thing is it being cooperative. But there is a competitive element in the way that you want to win against a threat of some kind. And people will the dungeon master has to run all of the monsters, all of the NPCs, all of the basic descriptions of what's happening. So in that way, sometimes it could become very you versus the dungeon master. But in reality, it's just sort of it's like a story you all tell together. So it's largely cooperative. A DM shouldn't want you to fail unless they're doing it creatively. They should want you to have fun and tell an interesting story, and that should be the point of it. You can play a character that is, you can tweak the numbers of the character to make it super good at doing something. And people call that like you min-max your character. But that's to your discretion. If it's fun for you, then, and it's not bothering anyone else, be the destroyer of worlds.
That makes me think of clearly there's not much competition within the game, but you mentioned earlier the rising kind of culture of these streaming services, people going online and watching. So do you notice kind of a competition between, these people, the people who are videotaping? And when I say competition, I mean going more above and beyond than, other people in terms of, theatrics, costume,
Hmm.
to gain more viewership and ultimately cha-ching, cha-ching, more monies.
I think because the nature of their work is that they are using intellectual property that is not their own. They can't be too competitive, especially with Wizards of the Coast themselves. And honestly, a lot of the people who end up getting very popular seem to be people who are uh, looking for outreach to fans to begin with. Like we talked about Critical Role, all the people involved in that are professional voice actors.
Oh,
They voice things in games. Like I think Matt Mercer does uh, the character McCree in Overwatch, and Ashley Johnson is in the Last of Us games. These people, they are people outside of their popularity streaming, and everything they, all the fans that, popularity that comes from their show is just, they seem grateful for it. Uh, Critical Role is just one example. The Acquisitions Incorporated people, they started doing their stream when the fifth edition was just being play tested and just being thought up. And they've been sort of with Dungeons and Dragons as this sort of gaming idea for years now. And now they also have their own official book that came out. But those people have always been very positive in their outreach to fans and their involvement in the community. It's sort of a group betterment almost, like people want them to be their best because they want to be a part of something they're proud to be a part of.
yeah.
So they reflect that back at their audience.
Um, that's interesting. I mean, I'm getting the vibe that the gaming industry and people that are creators in that are pretty entangled in this Dungeon and Dragons, or they're close. So I'd ask you, we have like a big animation program here. A lot of people that seem that would fit nicely going that route. So what advice would you give to people like that? In terms of just getting involved, getting their hands in it and whatnot.
Yeah, there's a lot of people who get involved with uh, creating content on tertiary websites. So there is a couple of websites like DM's Guild or Drive Through RPG that people will post their homebrew or original content on uh, just to get it out there for people to play with. So through creating adventures or creating art online and getting involved with those groups of fans and things like that, you can be uh, pumped up by other people who really like your stuff and get involved with the company that way. I know that Dungeons and Dragons proper, like the team that works on it at Wizards of the Coast, is kind of small. They're based in Seattle, Washington. But via the web portal like this, you can really uh, approach a lot more people. And an art is a big thing for them, especially, I mean, maybe not in terms of animation, but in parts of animation like character design, layout, background painting, all these little other aspects of art itself in animation. They're always looking for new people and looking for new people to collaborate with to inspire ideas or show off their content in the near future.
Yeah. I mean, do you think you would see this, in the next 20 years, perhaps going more into animation versus the still book, as technology advances, as VR becomes more apparent?
Yeah, I mean, they with the way streaming services are going currently, um, there seems to be a lot of chance taking by, like, a lot of risking by companies that they don't have to see a lot of fallback, because people will watch it even if, it's not something they necessarily want to watch. So I've noticed Netflix, um, Amazon, HBO Max has recently done some riskier, more original ideas in animation. So I wouldn't be surprised if we saw something in the near future for Dungeons and Dragons. And I know that Critical Role entirely crowdfunded an animated series for their show, basically.
Okay.
That's pretty unprecedented for me. They know what they're doing because they're in that industry, so that's a big plus in their favor too.
Yeah, I mean, when you mentioned that Wizards of the Coast had bought up this in, like, what was it, 77, I think you said. I don't know. Anyway, I mean, that was the whole reason why we saw the first Pokemon movie. I think they had the Yu-Gi-Oh movie. I mean, that was
Yeah,
kind of my light touching with the reverberations from Dungeons and Dragons when I was younger.
they're making a movie now. It's very, question mark about the content of it, but I know for a fact that they are making one. So that, if that really explodes, and I think it possibly could. They did make a Dungeons and Dragons movie, I think, in like 80s, like late 80s or something. It flopped horribly. It's a wonderfully bad movie. So
Was
here's
it the one
hoping.
that was like incriminating it? Are you talking about that one? The
Yeah,
one that made it seem bad?
yeah, it had like a CGI dragon that looked pretty bad in it, I think.
Yeah, they made it seem evil, and that people who did it were evil.
Oh, yes, there was a period of time
Oh,
where
those are two different ones. I thought you were talking about.
there was like a studio released movie that came out where it was almost like really, really bad, like play acting Game of Thrones level stuff. Like, it was really bizarre. But there was a long time where Dungeons and Dragons was demonized for
Yeah.
being related to satanic stuff, because killing demons was evil to some people, I guess. But it has since shaken off that sort of association, thankfully.
Yeah.
And yeah, the idea of it being, I mean, like, Pokemon was related to the devil, Dungeons and Dragons was related to the devil. They were looking for stuff, and when you have a game where you fight devils in it, then I guess it is related to the devil in some way.
Yeah, I'd say so. I'd say Devil's got his little fingers in there somewhere.
But there's also angels, so you get both sides, I guess.
Yeah.
There's big squids. You can fight a giant squid. It's a cuckoo world, just dragons.
Yeah. We've had a question chilling in the chat for a bit. What is the age of the youngest player you know of? The oldest?
So when I joined Adventurers League, I played with a couple of grade school kids, actually, who were in the 6th grade when I played with them, and are now 3 years later, I think they have graduated. And I will still talk to them on the regular on Discord. And the funny story being, like, as when I first joined, I found them very annoying. And over the course of playing with them and experiencing hardships and laughing at events and being scared of monsters together, became very endeared to these kids. And now, whenever they're running games of themselves, I always check out, see what they're doing. I'll do a one shot they run or something like that. And I'll say hi to them if I see them at the comic book store, still to today. So in that way, it's been a big positive force for kids and adults alike.
Yeah, well
We
put.
even ran a game where the couple I was running it for would bring their baby every single week, and the baby would sit there with a big stuffed 20-sided dice that they would throw, and we would say that would be their role for whatever the monster did or something like that. was very funny.
Hmm. There's so many things I could ask you. I'm trying to think.
Sure.
I was really interested in what you were saying about Rick and Morty's involvement because I had not heard of that, that they'd made a whole side thing for that. And coming from a perspective of someone who knows nothing to little of Dungeons and Dragons and being a big Rick and Morty fan and having a lot of similar friends and the like that probably are on the same boat. I think that's pretty interesting how they're, I mean, that's gonna, I think, bring so many more people into it. Were there any other like ones that were similar to that were pretty, you know, both new on the animation side, but also inclusionary and with Dungeons and Dragons?
I wouldn't say there's one like that particularly. Rick and Morty is the only cartoon they've paired with, but they did make an official Stranger Things adventure.
Oh, okay.
So if people who like that show, there's like a whole box set designed to look like the old version of D&D with the Demogorgon, who, you know, in the show is like a scary monster, basically has a place in real D&D now. So that way it joined. And the Penny Arcade people who I was talking about, they've had a very long running webcomic full of nerd culture stuff. That they, and since they had been sort of running this game in the world for so long, they now also have their own book of like Penny Arcade designed characters, and it's very, very like black comedy, tongue in cheek, like the Office style D&D. It's like you're a office worker, but you're also trying to kill goblins in a cave kind of thing. Which is a totally different flavor from, you know, people who want to be like Legolas or something like that.
Yeah.
Which is great.
That actually reminds me kind of vaguely of, I remember last time when we were talking, we were talking about Mercer and you were saying how there's kind of like two developing groups right now within Dungeons and Dragons.
Two developing groups.
Or just like, you know, there's two like people that were involved with the previous to the newer people that are getting involved and how they differ.
Oh, yeah, I would say that there's people, especially nowadays, who have played for a long time. You know, there's people who played Dungeons and Dragons since the 70s that are still playing Dungeons and Dragons today. And there is a bunch of new people who have totally different ideas about how they want to play. You know, I think what I had mentioned was some people prefer to play it as a sort of almost standard board game, like where it's just strictly you're going and playing the game mathematically and laughing and, you know, drinking beer, eating pretzels, kind of like partying game where you're just crawling through a dungeon and fighting monsters and gaining XP, finding treasure, things like that. But then there's people who prefer the more empathetic, narrative-driven stories of, you know, your characters going through of finding their coming to terms with their family's death or something like that. Like
Yeah.
there's a lot of room for what you can do in D&D.
So there's probably, so would you say there's groups out there, if you're not fully committed to that acting, if you're not going to be making the wizard voice and clapping the little jug, then you ain't a part of our crew?
Yeah. If you don't want to do the acting part, like I would say a big hurdle for a lot of people, I think we mentioned before, is that idea of putting it away in the back of your mind that you're play acting with your friends. And some people prefer not to get into character at all and rather just use it as what it is, a bunch of numbers on a sheet. And you know, you can min-max your characters, try to do, but then also the person running the dungeon can make it extremely deadly as possible. And in fact, there is a long-running history of the Tomb of Horrors, a adventure run by Gygax originally, that was so hard and so deadly that he would challenge people to try to beat it every year at Gen Con. And it was just, you know, full of nonsensical stuff that was meant to trick you to get you to instantly get killed or go into some fight you had no chance of winning, or turn you, like you would get obliterated or turned to dust or something like that, and just by entering a door. And that sort of running through that adventure over and over again, people would eventually learn all the tricks, and they could get to the end and win. And even then, in that aspect, I hesitate to call it competitive, because it's like it's something you're all doing together. They used to have, they would take math paper with the or grid paper, and they would draw the entire dungeon as they were going through it, so they would know exactly what they were looking at. This idea of people having huge maps. These days they have maps printed out that you can buy at stores and draw on and do all kinds of cool stuff with stuff in the books. But way back then, all you had was graph paper, and that was the only way you could tell if you were going to enter a room with a giant ooze or something like that.
Then, as the repetition of failing and not being so much about the failure or it being about the failure and the importance of that, and less on the actual end succeeding, reminds me of a game that you might know, Dark Souls.
Love it.
I way back when I was interested in the philosophy behind that game, and one of the ideas was just, I mean, I'm not going to get into the mother Oedipus complex that they were going into with it, but the general idea was, I mean, they're facing these characters that are just ridiculously overpowered, that you're kind of just meant to be destroyed by, like, over and over again. I've heard it's one of the most frustrating games to be playing if your goal is to succeed.
That high skill ceiling, but a very rewarding gameplay loop kind of thing.
Yeah, how would you say they compare? Probably not too much, or
I mean, I would say that I think Miyazaki, the designer, has gone on record saying that he is at least partially inspired by Dungeons and Dragons, or at least like Tolkienism in some degree. I mean, the sort of lordly aspect of the decrepit cities and things like that, and all the dragons being very important, seems very in that vein. And I would say Dungeons and Dragons for a time also had that moniker tied to it, where it was like, if you do one wrong thing, you're gonna get shot with 500 arrows and get taken out that way. I don't think it's as it doesn't have to be that kind of game, but it can be. I think even recently they re-released, or not that recently, but a couple of years ago, they re-released the Tomb of Horrors in a more modern setting, so people can run it for their new players, because so many new people were joining. So a whole new group of people could fall for all the traps that Gygax set up years ago.
That's pretty awesome. I wanted to ask you, just to bring back a little bit, because we're bringing up Dungeon Masters a lot, and I think I don't know too much about it, so I'm curious how you could explain the relationship of the Dungeon Master with the player as the game unfolds.
Yeah, so the dungeon mastering is really the next step of playing the game, by saying, I know this game well enough that I want to run it. And sometimes people can jump right into it. When I started playing D&D, I dungeon mastered for it the first time. I read the books, I got everything so my friends could play with me. I handed them out sheets and we tried it out for the first time. And there is a learning curve to that. You're basically, you're the answer to everyone's questions, and you are the computer that they are playing the game through. Which is great. I love being able to basically in real time react to people, what they're doing and what they say. You don't get that in every computer game.
Yeah.
So when you become a dungeon master, it really is asking for another level of input from you, because every NPC has to be you, every monster has to be you, but it doesn't have to be anything special. Especially when you're starting out, you don't know how you want to run a game. Maybe you don't want to make a voice for every character, or maybe you don't want to draw out huge dungeon maps. When you become the DM, you're also like the referee, and you're the the host. You're you're the quartermaster, remembering everything.
Yeah.
So it's very it's almost like running a class or something like that. Like you're the teacher with a class of students, and you have to know everything you're going to say and stuff like that.
Sounds
So
like
I
a
would say,
task.
yeah, getting into being a dungeon master is a big hurdle, but it is a hurdle with a lot of reward.
Yeah, sounds like it. I gotta ask you, you brought up earlier the cartoons, SpongeBob, what was it, Dexter, and
Yeah,
I
and
forget the other one.
it was the
But
original D&D cartoon. It was
yeah,
like a
yeah.
morning thing.
But one that just keeps coming to my head that you didn't mention was South Park. Curious your take on South Park's influence on D&D, because I feel like
Oh,
there's certain episodes that do touch on that.
I don't know as much about South Park. I know they had a World of Warcraft episode, but I didn't know they ever had a D&D one. It seems
That
like nowadays they would.
Yeah, no, I think that's what I'm talking about. But the way they play it reminds me a lot of more so on how you would play this. I mean, I know there's one where they're on the computer, but there's another one where they're out and about, and like I think it's more like the ripping Game of Thrones. But
Oh yeah, they did have a video game that was kind of like Game of Thrones inspired or something like that, right?
yeah, they might have made a game too. I was just talking about one of the episodes, like
Okay.
the guy who can't speak, he's like the queen or princess, and they're going around.
Mhm.
It's not directly referencing Dungeons and Dragons, but the motif seems similar.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah,
I mean, you could go back and probably see tons of references, especially in old games you may not have picked up when you or I were younger, like, you know, but when you see that sort of like the shield, the dungeon master screen, and all the kids at the table rolling dice, you sort of instantly recognize it for what it is, and you're like, oh, they're playing Dungeons and Dragons. And I think that speaks a lot to how much it's permeated all of the nerd circles. Like all those people, like, I'm sure that in Rick and Morty, the creator, made fun of Dungeons and Dragons, but it was only because he plays a lot of it. And he obviously
yeah,
played enough of it to want to like play the game and have his whole IP associated with the game. They made comics, D&D and Rick and Morty comics, and then they made the official book and stuff like that. So
yeah,
they love the game.
yeah. No, I figured if they were doing it, they had to love it. I mean, he seems like an avid participant.
Mhm.
I just wanted to mention some of the
Dan
last.
Harmon even ran a whole show about it. I think it was called like Harmon Quest.
Yeah, he did actually.
So
Yeah.
there you go. There's another big connection.
We got some comments uh, in the comments. Just so they have computer games. The Legend of the Stick, I think, was for the South Park, the game that we were trying to figure out. And also from Cartoon Network, Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy, another cartoon that seemed to have parodied
I believe it.
Dungeons and Dragons. Um, I think it's really interesting how Nickelodeon seems to be. Well, Nickelodeon, I mean, it does it with the SpongeBob, but it seems like Cartoon Network goes a lot more into the Dungeons and Dragons than the other. Would you agree?
Um, yeah, but I think that these days the script is flipped, and now it's like a positive thing. Like, like a lot of shows will show it as like, oh, we're just playing D&D together as friends, or they'll have like a D&D episode, and it will be something that people. It's more than just a reference. It's like a thing they're doing together. Which, if kids see that, they'll think, hey, they're playing. I see Steven Universe playing D&D or something. I want to play it. I want to play D&D. And I
Yeah,
think that'll great. I think it's great to get kids involved. I mean, I've seen kids play games with their parents and have a great time. So it's really something that I think helps a lot of people. And that's something I wish I had talked about more, was the social aspect and how it can help people play and work with outside of their spaces more.
Yeah, and I mean, I think from everything you said, I think that could kind of be gathered, subsequently. But I think that's where we have to wrap it up. It is 6:31. We've already went a minute past. I just want to say thanks to SGA and the Student Government Association for making this possible. Thank you, Ron, for coming. And remember, next week we'll be doing another webinar at 6:30. Have a good night, y'all.
Yeah.